It would be nice to create enough context where people could completely avoid the medical system. This context isn't necessarily for people who think they have a mental illness. It's more for people who think they don't have a mental illness. So in that way, it's not actually talking about a medical problem. I don't feel for myself like talking to myself in this way. I've been talking about my medical problem. I want to transition out of the medical model myself. It would have been amazing if 6 years ago they had a different context and I could have avoided it altogether by understanding this process and therefore not fearing it. So I don't think trans consciousness or neuro reemergence is a medical problem. And so if people are able to have that context, because really it's something that's been medicalized that isn't necessarily medical, it's a natural phenomenon. It's been turned into what it is because of the way it's perceived and received and responded to and reacted to. If it was responded to and reacted to in a completely different way, it would transform into something else. Even over the years before, people were just kept in institutions and never released and thought that they could never live in the community. And now most people are living in the community, but they're medicated. So to me, it only makes sense that in however many years from now, most people might be on medications for a short period of time and then not on anything. So it'll be seen as something that can be completely recovered from. And not necessarily recovered from, because that's saying it's an illness. It's a transformation. So the medication might help to slow down the process of transformation and the intensity of transformation. But the process still has to be completed and integrated, which might look like somebody completely redesigning and recreating their life. And it's pretty difficult to redesign and recreate one's life if one is completely dulled out by a lot of medications and then basically told to live in your parents' basement for the rest of your life. Whereas if it was received as a transformation, one would be supported to create a new life as the process is unfolding in order for the process to integrate and ease up, because one is moving towards that which the transformation is energetically pushing one through towards. And there was another thing that guy said when he did that talk about the factors that are important. One was genuineness. And I feel like I can't be genuine working in the medical model because I don't see it that way. So I can't be my genuine self. And this is more my genuine self. And I'm finding this easier to do, which is to speak as my genuine self. When I shared my story a while ago, and I thought I did a really good job, I never heard from the person that invited me to share, and I thought it was strange because I thought that maybe it was an affirmation that they didn't like what I had to say. Not that I said anything too extreme, but it just made me feel that way, I guess. Whereas I shared my story at this other thing and somebody emailed me and said, that was good, I want you to write an article about your experience there. And I don't usually expect anyone to say anything when I share, but the person who didn't say anything had a lot of opportunity to say something. So, and I'm not saying that as bad, I don't care. It's more I'm saying that as perhaps that's not the right direction for me to go if I'm unable to share as my genuine self. And I feel like maybe one day people won't be pathologized right away. They'll be supported through their distress, and then if a year later they're still struggling, maybe. And the trouble with a lot of this too is that the help is tied into the diagnosis. And there's help like finding a job or getting an amount of money per month because one can't work at the present moment. Lots of different supports. So the whole system of support would have to be redesigned, because people would still, even though they're not maybe mentally ill, they still might need financial support for a number of months in order to integrate the experience and move through their transformation. And actually, I did mention a study that somebody mentioned where they were using the open dialogue approach to people who had their first psychosis, and within 2 years, 72% were back to work. Now, people that are just medicated, I don't even know what the percentage is that goes back to work within 2 years, but it's probably very small. Like, I don't even know, like 10-20% or something. So maybe it's not true that it would have to be reworked that much, because perhaps people would really just get back to life and then not need this pathologizing. So somebody who has psychosis doesn't necessarily need a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They could just have psychosis and 2 years later be fine. But usually it's like psychosis, oh, and you have a few other things, oh, you have schizophrenia, and then it's turned into something chronic, and then the medications that are given increase the chronicity and ensure the pathology. It like locks a person into that paradigm, because generally when somebody's put on meds, there's not like a time limit. There's no, oh, well, after 2 years we'll see how you're doing, we'll reduce the meds. So one gets stuck in that automatically. So I think if it was received differently, people would transform and transcend and move on with their lives and move into a better version of themselves, minus the parts that were naturally just trying to fall away through the ego scramble. And maybe the universe isn't trying to get rid of the ego altogether, it's just trying to get rid of a certain percentage of the ego elements that are preventing a person from being their best self, because what the universe needs is a person to be their best self. It doesn't matter if they have 10% ego or 90% ego. If it's their best self, it's their best self. And I feel like the more ego one has, the more strong it is, the less one sees things in an altruistic way from a perspective of oneness. So it could just be trying to introduce more oneness and altruism. And yeah, the ego's not necessarily bad, because someone like Tony Robbins probably has a huge ego, but he's using it for so much good. And I wrote that our biomechanical energy is limiting our programming. What I mean by that, by doing habitual behaviors all the time, we're not reprogramming our brain. We're not doing new gestures that are going to shape our brains in different ways. And also when we're in habit, we're not perceiving, we're not learning, we don't have any new information. So that's actually stopping new insight. And perception eliminates programming. And programming is biomechanical energy wastage, because the programming is causing us to just act in habits, which is just wasting our biomechanical energy, going to work, watching TV. And so our thermodynamic energy, that entropy, is not actually being turned into new information. We are thermodynamic energy information processors. I think this has something related to when I'm coming to the end of my up-down cycle. Usually I feel freezing cold by the end of it. And I think there's something to do with entropy there, with thermodynamics, with information related to thermodynamics. And I don't know how that works, but it's like perception of more information. By having a clear mind screen, having access to more bits of information, that information has to be integrated. It has to go somewhere, which is sort of it's changing the entropy of the system in a way, and it's absorbing energy, so it makes us cold. So usually we have an ego compass, and we get turned into Gaia's compass and also Gaia's voice in map consciousness. And in a way, it's like being in dialogue with Gaia. I've thought before about the idea of being a thought leader. And I actually think that thinking, in its classical sense of rationalizing and abstracting, only produces new ideas to a varying degree, and it's pretty small. And that's still what's seen as thought leader, because people are not generally thinking up new things for themselves. Or maybe they are and they're not sharing them. So it's generally pretty limited in terms of the extent. Like a thought can be different from an old thought to a varying degree, and it's seen as something profound. And a person who's able to collect a number of those and be charismatic enough to share them is seen as a thought leader. And I actually feel like the word thought and leader doesn't go together very well, because thought is just from memory and thinking is very limited. And if we think that that process is what is going to lead us out of the struggles that humanity is in right now, we are mistaken. And to say thought leader like that's a great thing actually gets us trapped thinking that thought is going to save us. When Einstein himself said, we're not going to solve today's problems from the current level of thinking that created them. Because every new thought is from that same level of thinking. It's from the level of reason and logic. And I feel like the thoughts and the ideas and the insights that come out of map consciousness are from a level of love. And some of them are harder to make sense of because they're actually from somewhere beyond that we're even capable of seeing right now. And Dr. David Bohm said, we need a new source of thoughts and ideas. He said that in an interview with David Suzuki. And I feel like this other state of consciousness is at least one of those sources of other thoughts and ideas from beyond personal ego thought and personal education, and exploring and recombining people's old ideas. So I feel that perception extrapolation is actually more of a leading thing. Pattern recognition and extrapolating, which I guess might be called lateral thinking in a way. And when one can see laterally, when one can see with one's entire peripheral vision, and I actually read Dr. David Hawkins said that when you switch into those higher levels of consciousness, love and above, I think, you actually start to see more with your peripheral vision than your focal vision. And that's why I don't really subscribe to the idea of focus, because when one is focusing, one's only going to see what one's focusing on. And that is limited by one's education and the trajectory of one's life. Whereas if one is not focusing, one can actually take any perspective possible, and who knows what that's going to be. It's just going to be whatever in the moment. So I actually feel like it's more like extrapolation leader, extrapolating beyond. And maybe some people who are thought leaders are extrapolation leaders. I just don't really feel like thought is the best word to describe what's really needed, which is more like perception, insight, learning, seeing for oneself actually, and then unfolding through words and language what it is that one is trying to paint a picture of that one actually saw. Just like how Einstein would have some big insight and then it would take 2 years for him to put it into a way that people could actually understand what it was that he was trying to say. And even then, people still didn't necessarily get it or have the context through which to understand it. We need to hallucinate a more meaningful reality. Maybe all meanings are hallucinations and delusions. But the ones that consensus reality says are okay to believe, well, those are okay. And I feel like the stress in the body is actually what causes some of the epigenetic changes and maybe the bipolar biotypes that lead to these perceptions that are seen from the outside as hallucination and delusion, in order to move us out of the poison of society and start to co-create something outside of the realm of stress. And it's almost like those perceptions are what reduce the stress. Someone might still be in the same stressful environment, but then they have these perceptions and hallucinations and so-called delusions, and those are almost like self-medication to be able to keep one okay. And in a way, that's why we fantasize in our mind, because we can't stand the present moment. So I think there's a self-medication thing in the hallucination, but also it's showing what we could move towards in order to create a reality that we wouldn't have to hallucinate in order to experience. And the stress of this reality is like a collective stress, and then all of a sudden these children, they're being born without being able to acquire the language, which in a stressful reality, acquiring language would just increase the stress. It would increase the collective stress. So it's like a de-stressing, necessary reaction. Gaia is trying to grow other brains, and it does it in conjunction with the heartbeat. And the heart is sensitive to stress, and if it's beating in a stressful way, it's creating stressful molecules, and then the brain is unable to learn. But I think at a certain amount of stress, the brain starts to try to learn again by creating these hallucinations. Our brains aren't fully grown, and our brains are being misused. We're misusing the prefrontal cortex that has all this noise going on. I feel like normality is still a very delayed brain. It's been developmentally delayed. We're stuck in ego consciousness. What kind of brain grows in love? I just had a sense that the scale of consciousness is also related to our spine. Like the chakra systems, I guess, like the lower energies are sort of shame around our base chakra and things. And then we get into courage, which is kind of like our gut. And then we get into love, which is our heart. And then we get into probably joy is like the throat chakra. Being able to sing and speak, and so I just feel there's like this instrument that we are. And the lower chakras, they're not necessarily bad, though they're associated with shameful things. Because I just remember when I was in terror, I was having these sensations in my lower chakras, and I was also feeling absolutely terrified, like fight or flight. I wonder if speaking too sort of integrates the heart chakra and the higher chakra, because the speaking is in between. So it's a way to sort of integrate and give voice to both. And the language we use is important. Language below the level of 200, of anger, of jealousy, of shame, that is going to make us weak, whereas above 200 is courage. It's going to make us strong. And that's why I think all of this self-dialogue will actually help make my nervous system strong, partly because I've created a lot of context, a lot of brain cells, a lot of neuroplasticity around this, and it's all strength stuff. So in that way, I feel like it's possible my nervous system is stronger, in that I've used my words and my body and everything to speak about this, to speak it into neural reality at least. And then perhaps having that context in my own nervous system, I can emerge as that as I go about my daily life. And I feel like our nervous system is meant to perceive Gaia, not the little me, and referring every perception to that. We're misusing our nervous system, we're misusing our brain, we're misusing our voice. We're being used by it. And I think that's one of the fundamental differences, is using our voice versus being used by it. Using words, creating words, playing with words versus having them play on us. If we get stuck in word loops, I think they're only naturally going to be negative because they're not reporting on actuality. Because if we were actually perceiving actuality, we would be in ecstasy, joy, and bliss and love. There's no other way to be. The fact we hear our own voice in our head saying, repeating stuff, is delusion and is illusion.